Believe nothing you hear, and only half that you see. Edgar Allan Poe's The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather. This is the No Fear podcast. We know what scares you.
I'm Matt.
I'm Mel.
And I'm Lisa.
And this is the No Fear Cast, the podcast where we dissect horror and all the things that scare us. This is season 4, episode 11, and we are doing double duty, celebrating having cleared 100 episodes of this podcast, and then discussing the German silent film, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, as it turns 100 years old this year. So first off, before we get into what I'm sure will be a very interesting discussion of The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, we just want to take a little bit of time to say that according to Apple Podcasts, we have cleared 100 episodes of this podcast. So that's counting the bonus eps that we would put out occasionally. I think we did a couple for Halloween, and then we did some this past season. So, I mean, to be perfectly honest, I hadn't even really been thinking about how many episodes we had total. And I just happened to notice before the holiday season really took off that Apple Podcasts had us nearing like in the late 90s of episodes. And I don't know, it doesn't really feel like we've been doing it this long, but we're in our 4th season. So, I mean, my thoughts are that this is pretty cool. And I'm not sure precisely what I thought when we first started, but I'm glad we've been able to keep going. We've been really consistent. That's 100 episodes every other week for almost 4 years. Plus our, what is it now? 75 to 80 Patreon bonus episodes are coming out every other week. So I'm proud that we've put out that number of episodes, and I hope we can keep going. It's been a lot of fun. Matt, Lisa, what are your thoughts about this?
Well, first of all, I would like to say that we probably have almost as many mini episodes as we do main episodes, because we put them out every other week.
And we start at the beginning. Yeah, that's true.
And we did start pretty close to the beginning. So, yeah, just throwing the shameless little plug out there for the Patreon supporters. Not so shameless at all. But yeah, I was like you, I was not counting each episode. Like, I number them based on like the season. And so this would be like, this current episode is 411, season 4, episode 11. I'm not thinking in terms of continuous episodes. And so when you pointed out that we were getting close to 100, I had to actually stop and say, wait, is that right? Wait, huh? Because yeah, it doesn't feel like 100, and yet it feels like we've been doing this for a while as well. So yeah, it's been a weird, wild ride so far, and I only expect it to get weirder and wilder. I certainly had not expected that, like, within our first season, we would be talking to people like Grady Hendrix and Paul Tremblay or other horror icons so quickly. I figured that would be the sort of thing that would take us a while to get established before we could really dive into those sorts of things. So yeah, it's one of those things that doesn't feel like it's been that long, and yet then when you stop and think about it, it's like, wow, yeah, okay, I guess it has been 100 episodes. Wow, that's a lot. Like, that's a lot of episodes. So yeah, just I guess I kind of feel the same way you do. Like, wow, surprised but not surprised. I don't know how to describe it, but yay us.
What I find really funny about the fact that we've done this many episodes of the show is that when we first started talking about doing the show, we made a list of potential things we wanted to talk about. And I am almost positive that we haven't even made a real dent into that list yet. And that is exciting, because if we've been able to go on for 100 episodes, or maybe double that counting the minis, and not cover as many topics as we've wanted to, I mean, that just goes to show you just how enormous horror is as a genre. I mean, it really is almost an endless topic. And I think that would surprise a lot of people. Probably not the people who listen to this podcast. Because if you're a fan of horror, then you know just how varied horror can be. But I think if you're talking to somebody who doesn't, read or watch horror often, it might shock and surprise you that there's so much depth and breadth of topics to talk about, and that's exciting. We could keep this going for a while.
Well, I'm so glad you mentioned that list, because as we were starting out, one of my back of my mind concerns was that we would blow through the list, and it was a pretty decent sized list, like you said, but my concern was that we would run through it and then kind of hit a spot where we had kind of run out of ideas and had to really scramble to find things. But I think you're exactly right. We definitely have not finished tapping that vein of stuff, and that was things that we've mostly brainstormed 4 years ago and have added to here and there since. But yeah, it really does show, like you said, how much there is to explore with this genre. And we kind of found a rhythm of doing 3 to 4 episodes on a particular topic, but I think some of these topics we could have done even more. So that's I think that's a really cool thing too, that, like you said, horror is, well, no surprise, like you said, to the listeners. It's a pretty deep and varied genre.
Yeah, and we've already started this season. I think we did in season 3 too, going back to topics that we talked about in the first season, adding on to them. We ended up doing a more updated haunted house episode at the beginning of this season that kind of built on what we'd already done with haunted houses. And creepy children and ghosts had been on our list since the very beginning, and we kind of teased that always. If we talked about that, we'd say, oh, that's coming up, So yeah, I think the times we've talked about more contemporary movies, maybe we've gone off the list, but for the most part, we've pretty much been kind of running through it. And yeah, there's a lot left to do, and even more stuff out there that we keep adding and talking about. So yeah, we have almost endless topics people talk about. So it's been fun. All right, guys, do you want to transition now to our discussion of the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari?
Oh, I can't wait for this one.
Okay. I watched it twice just so I would, know precisely what was going on. All right. So when we talked about clearing 100 episodes and what we could do, I think it was Lisa, you reminded us that the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari came out in 1920. So this is its 100-year anniversary. And the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari is an interesting movie. And it's kind of interesting for me too, because I think, Lisa, you and I have talked about this before, but Cabinet of Dr. Caligari has kind of been on my radar for several years, but I just never sat down and watched it. And then last year when we were at StokerCon, there was a panel on it, and I was like, I really need to move this up on my list. So talking about it for this podcast has been really great in that respect, that it finally got me to sit down and watch it. And listeners, if you are interested in checking it out, it is available on Amazon Prime, and I'm pretty sure it might be available on YouTube as well. It came out in 1920, so I'm pretty sure the full movie is available there. So if you want to pause here and go watch it and come back and listen to our conversation, that's great. I don't know that us, quote unquote, spoiling the movie would really mess it up for you if you want to watch it after we talk. Let me see. I'll give a little bit of background about the movie, and then we can get into a discussion of it. So this movie was directed by Robert Weine. You can yell at me, Lisa, if I mispronounce these German names. It was a German expressionist silent film, so there's German names or something I'm going to have to pronounce here. It was written by Karl Mayer and Hans Janowitz, and Werner Krauss played Dr. Caligari. And just a little bit of trivia, Conrad Veidt played Cesar, the somnambulist, and he went on to play other roles, among them Major Strasser in Casablanca in 1942. One of the things I saw online about him, I think he was in over 100 movies. And so Casablanca is probably the best known one in Caligari. All right. So with that kind of background out there, I guess let's start with our first impressions. Lisa, Matt, what were your first impressions watching this?
Wow, that is an insane movie. Was kind of my first thought watching it. Like you said, it's a movie that's been kind of on my radar. I've been aware of its existence, but I had never actually sat down and really watched it until this past weekend, actually getting ready for tonight's episode that we're recording. And so, yeah, like it was an interesting movie. It was very, the set design, I think, was what really, really caught my eye the first time. Like, just kind of, it's hard to describe in an audio podcast a movie for listeners who can't actually see it. But if you want to like Google pictures of the set, it's so angular and almost like this weird fever dream is kind of what it feels like most of the time. And that's kind of how I felt watching it, going, where is this going? Because it loops around and the plot twists and turns in a bunch of different ways. But yeah, I enjoyed it. I mean, I can definitely see why. I think it was Stephen King or someone who said that this is like probably the first horror movie per se, or one of the first. And yeah, I think it was it's definitely interesting.
Matt, I completely agree with you about the set design, because that's one of the things that I think people talk about when they discuss this movie, because it fits so perfectly in with the German expressionist movement. So if we have any listeners out there who are fans of art, and because the 1920s, of course, was when the expressionist movement was really big, but we also saw a rise in like Dadaism and things like that. And so it fits. It reminded me at times, and this would be a bit earlier than the movie, but you can see, I think, the influences of it on it. But like, if you were to set a movie inside an Edvard Munch painting, it kind of fits that, because like you said, Matt, everything was very angular and highly stylized. So for instance, I love, one of my favorite set designs is when the stairs leading down to, like, I guess it's the prison, because it's not just a normal staircase. It's this like curvy, almost Dr. Seuss type staircase that they come running down several times. There's several shots where they do that, and it's really neat. So a lot of people talk about that. What struck me this time, because I was watching it for this podcast, and I was thinking that a lot of people have, like you said, Matt, called it the first real horror film. I know that's debated, because there are other silent films that predate this one that have things like ghosts and that sort of thing in them. But I think this is really, you could call it the first true horror film that's meant that way. But what struck me is that it's a psychological horror movie. And I think that's something really neat when you look at the birth of the horror film, to see that the psychological horror film was there from the beginning, because Matt, you called it a fever dream, and it does feel that way. And it's one of those stories, and I wrote this down at some point when I was watching the movie, and I said, this is the story of madness, but the question is whose madness is it?
I think that's an excellent summation.
Yeah, I mean, because is it the madness of Caligari? Is it the madness of Francis? I mean, we don't know, right?
And it could go either way. I mean, even when you finish the movie, the frame story doesn't necessarily fully answer the questions.
Well, and before we get too far away from it, I did want to say that, speaking of the set design as being like inside of a Munch painting, I one of my primary thoughts after finishing this was like, I would not be surprised if you had told me that Franz Kafka had written the script for this movie. You know, it has a lot of that sort of almost weirdness and nihilism of his as well. So while we're just throwing out Germans, I think Munch and Kafka together could have made a pretty good version of this movie.
Yeah, I completely agree with what you guys are saying. The sets were fascinating to me. The stairs that you described, Lisa, and then sometimes where they would have almost like the painted tendrils going down hallways, and the fact that even the landscape looked like sharp blades. At one point, I thought the grass was a fence. It was so had this almost like papery or wooden look to it, which is really kind of harsh. But before we go too much further, I think we probably need to do a little bit of a summary of the movie. So the movie has a frame to it, which you don't, I mean, you know, it has a frame because it starts out with two men sitting on a park bench. One man is named Francis and he's talking to the other man. The other man that he's talking to is saying stuff that doesn't really make a lot of sense. I believe he's saying something about their spirits, like preventing him from doing something. And then our main character, our protagonist, says, well, let me tell you the story about me and this other woman. I believe the woman's name was Jane, right?
Yeah.
Yes. Jane is also there. She like walks by the park bench at some point. And so then we kind of go back in time and he tells us this entire story of how there's this German town and they are having this carnival. This man named Dr. Caligari comes and he wants to be part of it. He wants to have his own little sideshow in a tent. And he has a cabinet. And in that cabinet, he has a man who he claims has been sleeping for almost 25 years. And that when he wakes this man, the man will be able to answer people's questions because he can make prophecies. Now, as soon as Caligari and Cesar show up, murders start happening. So first, the town clerk who wouldn't allow them initially to be in the carnival, but then changes his mind. He dies. He's murdered. Then our main character goes with his friend to see the show, and his friend asks Cesar when he will die, and Cesar says by dawn, and he's murdered. And then our protagonist goes and finds a doctor and gets some police, and they're watching because he thinks it's the somnambulist, Cesar, that's doing all the murdering. And he watches him sleeping in his cabinet while we see Cesar go after Jane. In this, when he's being chased while he's carrying Jane, Cesar falls to his death in a ravine. They realize that the person in the cabinet that the main character is watching was not him, it was a dummy. He then chases Dr. Caligari to a mental hospital, an asylum, and discovers that Caligari is not a patient there. He actually runs it. Then there's this kind of small scene back to back where when Caligari is asleep, he's going into his office and gaining all this evidence that Caligari actually took on that name after this medieval monk who had someone who had been asleep for many, many years and would use him to perpetrate murder that he would not be captured for, that nobody could prove that he had done. And then at the end of the movie, after he's told us that Dr. Caligari has been kind of apprehended and he's now a patient, our main character is talking to this man on the park bench, and we realize that all the people wandering around are not in a park. They're actually at that asylum or that hospital, and our main character is a patient there. So you're wondering, if Dr. Caligari is really a bad person or if any of this ever happened. He sees Caligari come out because he's the doctor there. He gets excited, tries to attack him. They put him in a straitjacket and they throw him in the same cell that Dr. Caligari had been in. And at the end of the movie, Caligari kind of turns to the camera and says something to the effect of, I now understand his mania. I know the cure. And I don't know about you guys, but there's a couple of different ways to look at this. I mean, one is that the frame story shows that our narrator has been mad the whole time and didn't really know what he was talking about. But I felt at the end that there was that possibility that maybe the Caligari character, the head of this hospital, really maybe had like some sort of dark purpose, that perhaps the whole story maybe wasn't necessarily true. It came out of the guy's imagination to a certain extent, but I don't know that he's necessarily going to like take care of this man properly at the end of the film. I felt like there was a bit of darkness and maybe a little bit of a lack of hope there.
That last line is so sinister.
Mm-hmm.
And that just shows you how effective this movie is, because when you're watching, well, the version I watched had a soundtrack to it, which I guess the original one would have too. I'm not sure if this was at all like the original because I didn't watch I think there's a Kino restored version, but I didn't watch that one. I just watched one of the free ones I could get on Amazon. So I'm not completely sure about the music, but it does set the scene very well. And it does make everything seem kind of sinister. But that last line, and again, it's not even spoken. You read it on the title card or whatever they call whatever those are called. Yeah, when he says, "I know how to cure him now," that, then it just kind of fades. And that bothered me. I was like you, Mel. I thought, okay, either this guy was telling the truth and Caligari is, or the head of the asylum is Caligari, and he is an evil man who's been murdering him, but nobody believes him because they think he's a crazy person. And amongst all the, that he doesn't know what's happening. And if that's the case, then that's pretty dark. It could be that this was all part of Caligari's plan, and part of his quote unquote cure was to make Francis more mentally unstable, I guess, through some sort of sinister means. Kind of, I guess, what he would have done to Jane, because Jane at the end, I thinks she's a queen.
She does, yeah.
Or she thinks she's some sort of royalty, and she's kind of walking around in this daze. It's very effective. Again, this long white dress, almost specter-like. Or I guess another way of reading it would be that maybe Francis is mentally ill and has been from the beginning, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the asylum director isn't the villain too, if that makes sense. He still could be doing something nefarious, and Francis is telling it in the only way he can, by telling the story. I don't know. Again, this goes back to if we pinpoint this film as being the beginning of the modern day horror film, I love that it's not only psychological in nature, but it does have that ambiguous ending, because so many writers and filmmakers today are playing with the ambiguous ending. Matt, you mentioned we've had Paul Tremblay on this podcast, and he does that really effectively in his books, kind of leaving you thinking, did I just read that the right way, or can I read it another way? And yeah, I think there are several ways you can read that ending, and that last line is absolutely sinister no matter what.
Yeah, I agree. And I like the way you brought in the fact that a lot of horror uses ambiguity really well. The irony of that, I guess, is, in some of the articles that I was reading about the movie, there's a lot of debate over why the movie even has a frame. And I never saw like specific kind of answers as to what happened. I think the writers have said that there wasn't one, but maybe in the original script there was a frame, but it was different. But apparently the producers of everybody were kind of for this particular frame, because they said they needed it, or people wouldn't like it, or they wouldn't be able to screen it. But there's a lot of debate over how it got there and who put it there and that sort of thing. But I kind of like the frame, because I think it plays off of what the movie's doing from the very beginning, which is questioning reality. I mean, whose reality is this? Who can you trust? It kind of takes on point of view. And I feel like it's more horrifying to get to the end and not know who you can trust or what's actually happening than it would have been had we just had a clear ending. Caligari's evil, or Francis is mad, and that's it. It also allows them to play with the themes of authority and control. And I thought, watching the movie, I thought it was interesting how Caligari is kind of remote controls Cesar to go murder people for him. Cesar is like, completely controlled by him. And in the end of the movie, when Francis kind of stands up to him, being the head of a mental hospital, or an asylum as they would have called it then, he has the power to be like, okay, you don't have free reign in the yard anymore. You're going to be locked up in this tiny little cell in a straitjacket, and I'm going to give you the cure, whatever that is, like change you or make you not believe what you thought. And so I like that juxtaposition of the ambiguity of the ending and also the questioning of reality, but also that like the fear of outside control too. Because Francis, if he really is the head of the asylum, it'd be very difficult for Francis to fight against him. And Caligari kind of seems to have this Caligari or non-Caligari, whichever, has this power over other people. He wants to control other people.
Yeah. And I think it's important to point out too, I mean, this is 1920. We're obviously falling back on, I think we're all struggling to talk about how we talk about like what kind of place Francis is in at the end, asylum, institute, madhouse. But I think we're leaning on like a 1920 understanding of it, because knowing what we know about mental health and mental institutions around that time period was not pretty. And when you talk about that, the control and this submission, I guess, to authority, or the authority having complete control, that would play into that as well, which I agree with you. I kind of lean towards liking that, the framework narrative of it as well, because of that. If you just had the story of Dr. Caligari, the kind of middle story, you'd still have that running theme of control, because he does control Cesar in a way that's really uncomfortable, because we haven't even talked about Cesar too much. If he's been asleep for, they said 25 years, he looks like a young man. So I guess we're supposed to think that Caligari has had him since birth.
Well, that's something I couldn't tell. That another thread of ambiguity there is, like you said, he looks like he isn't much older than 25 himself, and so that was my very first thought, was how has he been sleeping since a baby, or I wondered maybe if they're meant to imply that not only has he been sleeping, but it's been some kind of like stasis for like 25 years. That's the only way that it can make sense to me, because if he was asleep for 25 years, then like Dr. Caligari has not just been abusing this man, like he's been abusing someone who was at least like 2 or 3 when they went into that state. So that's like the only thing I can think of. But again, it's very ambiguous what that means, and no answers are given as to what is going on with Cesar in terms of whether or not it was stasis or just he actually has been asleep since childhood.
In Francis's reminiscences, when he and the doctor, of course, this is coming from Francis, so I don't know if it's reliable, but when he's going through Caligari's papers with the doctors, he says, he found a man who had been asleep for almost 25 years, and they had what I think was supposed to be a flashback, because every now and then while Caligari is supposed to be asleep in his bed and they're going through papers, all of a sudden Caligari will be moving around in his office doing things. And at one point they roll Cesar in, the other doctors, in a chair, and he looks about the same as he did in the cabinet. And then Caligari is like, yes, that's when he says, I must know, I must become Caligari. And the word Caligari is all over the screen and the trees and everything. So maybe I'm wrong, but I kind of got the feeling that might have been a flashback. So I don't know if Cesar has been sleeping for 25 years in stasis or since a child, but I think Caligari got him in Francis's thoughts, whether they're real or not, and after he had been asleep for that long, if that makes sense. Like he had been somewhere, like with his family or something, and they brought him there. And then Caligari's like, oh, I'm going to use this guy to murder people. That was the impression I got.
I had forgotten, because you're right. It was a flashback, because I get so taken away with the scene where he goes into the forest to become Caligari. Mm-hmm. Because it strikes me, there were a lot of, what it reminded me of, and I don't know the date on this. It reminded me of when Snow White went into the woods in the Disney version, because that one is very expressionist light, I guess you could call it, when they do that, because you have the when she goes into the woods and it gets very dark, and you start seeing the eyes of the animals and like the scary trees coming out and grabbing her. Mm-hmm. It reminds me of that scene, except instead of scary animal eyes, you see the word Caligari being written all over the scary trees.
I hadn't thought that, but you're right. And that's 1937 is when Snow White came out, at least according to Wikipedia.
Okay. Well, thank you, Wikipedia. And I just thought, I love that scene, because it's showing his well, again, that's showing his madness and in the form of obsession, right? That he gets so sucked into, I must know this. It becomes an all consuming obsession for him. And that is what is kind of haunting him. And I love that scene where it starts writing Caligari all over the place. There were so many good things in this. I maintain Snow White, the Disney Snow White, was a horror movie anyway. So
my child self that was traumatized agrees with you.
Well, and there, talking about not to get off topic a little bit, but talking about the influence that this had on films that were to come when Cesar commits the murders. Especially, well, in the scene where he goes to kill Alan, but also in the scene where he goes and I guess tries to kill Jane, but ends up kidnapping her because she wakes up and they have that fight. When he's sneaking around, it reminded me so much of Nosferatu, which was made, only 1 or 2 years after this film, right?
I think so, yeah. It was afterward, but pretty close on the heels of it.
Yeah. I mean, you can just see
the use of shadow too.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, he seems to be a shadow.
Those are definitely 2 peas in a pod kind of movies. Cesar, he definitely seems like a shadow, like you said, even down to almost even a ghoul. I mean, down to the makeup that they put around his eyes. I mean, he looks very ghoul-like, which I guess they're partly doing because he's sleepwalking, so to speak. But
yeah, the scene at the carnival was really effective too. Speaking of that eye makeup, Matt, when Caligari commands him to wake for the first time, and it comes in close to his face, and it almost looks like it was a painful thing. Whatever the actor was doing, I loved it, but it almost looked like it was painful for him to open his eyes. And then when he finally works his eyes open, it's this look of it's this really wide-eyed look of horror on his face. And again, that harkens back, Mel, to what we were talking about with the idea of control too, because you see when I watched that, I thought, oh, this is somebody who doesn't want to be awake. This is somebody who doesn't want to be opening his eyes right now. And he is.
Yeah, Cesar is an interesting quote unquote monster figure because, I mean, he's almost, in some ways, he's reminiscent of Frankenstein's monster in a way. Caligari makes him entirely his own and forces him to do these things. He's under his control. And when he tries to kill Jane, he can't. I thought it was cool that Jane stood up for herself and fought back the way she did. And then he kind of takes her off. You're right. I mean, when he opens his eyes, he almost looks he's in pain. At one point, Caligari is trying to feed him. I mean, I felt sorry for Cesar. I felt like he was kind of this weird enigma or hole at the center of the story. I would have liked to have known more about him. Of course, on the frame, we find out that he's perfectly fine and he's just apparently a patient at the hospital that Francis is at. But as the somnambulist, he was like this enigma that I wanted a little bit more information about. Going back to our earlier conversation, trying to figure out even where he came from. I find myself wondering about him, even though it's a silent film, obviously, but he says nothing, even though it's a silent film, and he's sleeping during most of it. It's a very interesting character because you can put all sorts of interpretations on him or all sorts of questions on him. And you can feel pity for him or sympathy for him, even though he's doing these terrible things, because he doesn't appear to have much agency.
Yeah, he seems to be the one who's both kind of monster and victim.
Yes. Yeah, that's a good way to look at it.
Did you know, in looking this up, so one of the things I do when I watch these older movies is I think about how it would be done today. And maybe that's just because of the time we're living in where I feel like everything gets a remake eventually. And I started, thinking about what this would look like. And I knew it had been remade. I have not seen any of the remakes. It was remade in 1962. And that one was actually written by Robert Bloch, who did Psycho. So I'm curious about that. But then there was also one in 2005, which I vaguely remember, although I did not see. And so I was just curious to see who they got to play Cesar in that. And it's actually played by Doug Jones, who is the actor. I mean, y'all have seen him in a lot of things. He was in Pan's Labyrinth and played the monster creature with the eyes in his hands.
Oh, okay.
And he played the creature in The Shape of Water. He played the zombie character in Hocus Pocus. Like he's done a lot of these kind of horror creature, but really wide-ranging ones. And now I'm just really curious to see what he would look like playing this character and how they would exactly put it on. So I don't know. I'm gonna have to after we record this, I may have to go look up that 2005 one, because when I saw he was cast, just made me really, really curious.
Yeah, I apologize. I think I had some road engine noise there in the background when you were talking. I had no idea about the 2005 movie. I saw something about the 1960s version. From what I saw of the plot, it was very different. So I think they just kind of like took the name and maybe some of the themes. I believe it was somebody luring a woman into a house is the 60s version. But the 2005 version might be closer. I don't know.
I mean, when I saw it was redone in the 60s, again, I wasn't surprised because, and that was around the time period where they were taking like Poe's stories and everything and just slapping the name on a plot. So I really wasn't too curious about that. But then when I saw it was in 2005 and it specifically saw Doug Jones was playing that character, I was just like, I wonder what that would look like. I wonder what they did. Like I said, I didn't look into it at all beyond that. So I am really curious. And I wonder if you could do it outside, because as prescient as this film was and kind of setting a lot of the tones and the tropes that we still use today in the horror film, it's also very connected to its time. This kind of 1920s German, like, I don't know if you could redo it today in the same way, if that makes sense.
No, I get it. It'd be very difficult. I mean, you would have to address all the changes we've had in the mental health system, for one, since the 1920s.
Not to mention the cultural differences that between Germany in 1920 and wherever this would be produced in 2020. I think German expressionism in Germany in 2020 definitely, like, it is in many ways a product of its time period, so to speak.
Yeah, the intensely stylized production values would have to definitely be changed too.
So is that it? Does that mean that we're going to try to remake this movie ourselves?
I'll have to check out the 2005 one first, I guess, to see what they did.
The question is who would you cast?
Well, I mean, Cesar reminded me a bit of Johnny Depp and Edward Scissorhands. So there's a...
Yeah, me too.
There's
really?
a possibility. Maybe it's just the face with the dark circles around his eyes, but like the face and the hair. I mean, otherwise, like, not character-wise in any way, but just visually a bit.
Yeah, I could see that. In one of the articles I was reading about the Cabinet Dr. Caligari, the person who wrote it said that they thought there was maybe some bit of influence, maybe, or at least a slight similarity in those two characters. So yeah, I could see that.
I mean, I wouldn't be shocked to find out that was an inspiration for Tim Burton. He's weird enough to have probably watched that a lot, like multiple times when he was a kid or something,
I would like to see his redo of
that one would absolutely have Johnny Depp, and then Helena Bonham Carter would be Jane, of course. So
mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I could not disagree with y'all more.
Well, I'm just saying,
a movie I do not want to see.
Oh, I wasn't saying I wanted to see the Tim Burton version. I was just saying that's how it would be cast.
Mhm. Something being interesting doesn't necessarily mean it'd be enjoyable.
Yeah. See, y'all went that direction with Johnny Depp. I always saw maybe a little bit younger Crispin Glover playing Cesar.
I could see that too. I could absolutely see that.
Yeah. I don't know who I'd cast in the rest of it though. This is why I don't cast movies. But yeah, it would be, and I think it would, even though I don't want to see the Tim Burton, I think you would have to have a director like that who had their own specific style markers to make it something different from the German expressionist one you have today, because I think that would also be the wrong direction to go in if you were trying to remake the expressionist. You would have to change all that. I just don't know who I would want.
My vote is Scorsese.
Well, before we get too far into the dream casting of a more contemporary Caligari, I kind of want to go back a little bit to the influences that we were talking about. So we were talking more about what Caligari may have influenced in the future. But when I was watching it the other day for this episode, I found myself thinking, especially when you get to that end part of the frame story and you find out what's going on, Francis might be a patient in this hospital. I found myself thinking of Edgar Allan Poe's The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather that was published in the 1840s. And that is why, listeners, that was our introductory quote to this episode: believe nothing you hear and only one half that you see, which I think is a great quote to just describe the movie itself. Even though it's a silent movie, you can't really believe anything that people are saying in it. And so I was like, I wonder if other people have noticed this as well, because I'm not an expert on Caligari. So I started poking around, and apparently several other critics have said that there seem to be some similarities between the story and the movie. Kim Newman, in particular, apparently mentions the connection in passing in his book, Nightmare Movies, Horror on the Screen since 1960. And the reason The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather popped into my mind is because it is a story where, I guess if you want to look at it this way, like madness and deception and delusion and reality are all mixed up very similarly to the movie. The System of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather is just a made up system. Dr. Tar and Professor Feather are not real people in the story. So this guy, our hero, protagonist in the story, is traveling through France. He sees this hospital. He says that he's heard that they're using the quote unquote soothing method at this hospital, where instead of, bear in mind, this is the 19th century, instead of locking up people in a mental institution in cells like they were doing in Caligari's institution or hospital, they're letting them walk around. They can be all over, they can walk around the grounds, they can have their own room, they can be in living areas. And he wants to stop and meet the guy that runs this hospital and see the system in person. And he goes and he's hanging out with this guy and the people who supposedly work for him, and strange things are happening and he doesn't understand what's going on. And at one point, the guy that he's talking to, that he believes runs a hospital, tells him to believe nothing that he hears and only one half that he sees, and tells him a story about what he calls an extremely stupid young man who came to a hospital in France to see how this method worked, only to realize that things were not as they seem. So what has happened is that the patients have kind of risen up and put the employees and the doctors into the cells in the basement of this building that they used to use before they used the quote unquote soothing method. So the narrator has been hanging out with the patients at the hospital the entire time, not realizing it. And at the end, it's so unclear if he even realizes it, even when the doctors get free. So you have a story where it's not necessarily clear. The line between the people who are seen as quote unquote insane is not necessarily clear between them and the doctors who are taking care of them. And it reminded me a lot of Caligari, because even in the end, like Lisa and I talked earlier, we're not sure that Caligari is like what is, as Faulkner said in As I Lay Dying, it's not necessarily that people are sane or insane. It's the majority of people that talk them that way. Like it's whatever other people think you are that you end up locked up, as being quote unquote insane. So this idea of this thin line between what's real and what's not, or who's quote unquote deluded and who's not, or what the real story is. I think there's a lot of kind of similarities there. I don't think they were like remaking the system of Dr. Tar and Professor Feather, but I think this is an interesting theme of like late 19th century lit and now Caligari in the early 20th century. So I don't know. What do you guys think about that connection? Did you see that? Was that just me with my Poe thoughts, or how do you think it works?
I absolutely can see that comparison. And not just the subject matter either, but Poe liked to do this, but he loved the unreliable narrator, and that's absolutely, and we haven't thrown out that turn yet with Caligari, but we've talked about it. How we don't even know from the beginning whether or not we can really trust Francis when he starts talking at the beginning of the framework device, because the first time I had watched that movie, when Francis starts talking, he says, well, I have a tail that can beat yours, basically. And so you don't even know when watching it if right away he's telling you, well, are you just telling a story? Or is this, so I don't know. From the very beginning, it seems to be set up that way. And that is a very Poe thing no matter what. But then to have the idea of we don't know who the patients are and who the doctors are. And that's absolutely what happens in Caligari. It twists and turns where you think, oh, Caligari is the madman. No, he's in charge. Oh, no, they realize he's crazy and they've put a straitjacket on him. Oh, no, but he's out. He's in charge again. So it constantly flip-flops. And that's what's happening in the Dr. Tar and Professor Feather. I also wonder, and I had just looked this up really briefly, and again, this is something else I'm jotting down for further research, but apparently this Poe story was performed at the Grand Guignol. Sorry, I'm going to butcher the French. But the Parisian theater that was famous for putting on all the horror. So I don't know. I want to say maybe there was even a German film that came out. I know it was adapted to television and films later, but it might actually be not just in your head, Mel, but an actual direct influence on Caligari. It'd be worth looking up.
Yeah, we need to look into that because, I mean, the French loved Poe and, European culture did as well. So there was a lot of influence going back and forth in the literary realm. I wouldn't be surprised if there's more than just a passing connection to it, but definitely thematically it works.
Absolutely. No, that was a good comparison to make. Although Poe's story is much, much funnier, I think.
Yeah, the Poe story has comedy in it, and there's not murders happening.
Well, I mean, just the tar and feather of it. He was having fun with the
and the cluelessness of the narrator, because as the reader, well before he does, what's going on.
Yeah. Well, what did they say in this story? That he's just a stupid-looking man.
Pretty much, yeah.
Yeah. I don't know if that's the direct quote, but it's something like that. Well, we started this episode off by talking about the 100 episodes that we've done and how we haven't tackled all of the topics that we've wanted to talk about. And I think here, this has given me at least 3 or 4 things to add to to our list of things that we want to talk about in the future. So in the next 100 episodes of this podcast, I would absolutely, number one, I would love to look at more silent films because we've talked about this one. We've talked about Nosferatu. There are so many other good ones that play around with horror elements and Oh gosh, just the Matt, you mentioned it, the black and white use of shadow and light, and that's a whole rabbit hole I want to jump down. Mel, you brought up Poe. That just brings up so much more that I want want to talk about when it comes to Edgar Allan Poe, because I feel like we've mentioned him. We're going to have to talk about him more in depth. You mentioned also that these are both stories that are dealing with either in the middle of it or the aftermath of this kind of like 19th century view of mental health. There are so many horror stories set amidst not just the mental health system, but like the abuses of the mental health system that I think would be worthwhile to go down that road. We've mentioned theater. I would love to talk about more about horror's role in the theater. Oh my gosh, there's so much here that I want to talk about. So that makes me very hopeful and very excited for our next 100 episodes. And I, for one, would just like to take a moment to tell our listeners thank you. Thank you for sticking with us as we go through all this. As we've been through 100 episodes and hopefully have 100 more in the future. Just again, thank you for coming on this journey with us. As a reminder, we want to tell you that Mel and I wrote a nonfiction book about the women who have written horror and dark speculative fiction titled Monster She Wrote. You can get your copy by going to the Quirk Books website or through any major book retailer. We'd love to hear from you. We're at No Fear Cast on Twitter and Instagram. We also have a Facebook page. If you'd like to contact us by email, it's nofearcast@gmail.com. If you love what we're doing, consider supporting us on Patreon and get access to the exclusive content, including those other 100 episodes we talked about. Or simply rate and review us, which is entirely free and helps other listeners find us. Thanks for listening, and we will be back in 2 weeks with a brand new episode.